Alright guys, today's the day. You guys know the drill. Targon's coming out, and I'm going to quickly fire off 11 new decks for the Targon expansion. These are going to be not like insanely refined decks. They are as refined as like we're able to make pre-launch decks. So I mean, they're great day one decks, and I'm going to be updating all of these as I go. If you want to pull up any of them, there's going to be the links in the pinned comment that you'll be able to pull out and import the code into your client. So just make sure you're pulling the codes from the pinned comment and not what you see on screen, because those are going to be the ones that I update as I go. Alright, let's just go ahead and get started. In no particular order at all, we're starting with Lulu Demacia. This one's a pretty straightforward vanilla deck, and these aren't going to be big evaluations or analyses. I'm just going to explain the deck and move on next. So basically, it's Lulu plus Demacia. We're going to make a small cheap challenger big. That's going to be usually Fleet for the Tracker, but sometimes Valor off of Blinding Assault. We're going to be leveling up our Lulu very aggressively, as well as our Shen, and we're going to be using a lot of supports and quick attacks to be able to empower things further. There's a really adorable combo with Rush and Blinding Valor, where you can actually kill 2 enemies on 1 turn for free. Next up, we've got my Elusive Shadow combo deck. This is a deck that I'm a bit excited for because I've actually played around a lot with this similar concept even before Stalking Shadows and Encroaching Shadows were added to the game. Basically, the idea is we're making a bunch of elusives to OTK the opponent very, very reliably and very, very effectively. We're going to clone a bunch of Green Glade duos off of using stuff like Fading Memories, as well as stuff like Stalking Shadows. So, in getting a lot of Green Glade duos, we're going to be able to kill the opponent really quickly in 1 turn by keeping Navori Blade Scouts in our hands and saving Encroaching Shadows until we're able to go ahead and end the game with the Encroaching Shadows kill. So a couple of tips with this deck that are going to be really, really important. We don't want to be using cards like Encroaching Shadows or Navori Blade Scout too early. These cards are combo pieces, and you want to save them in your hand until the turn you're about to win the game, right? You can use Encroaching Shadows the turn before, but usually you really don't want to be playing this too early, and that's going to be how a lot of people lose games with this deck. For the most part, we're just trying to discount our hand, make sure our entire combo is very cheap and will happen all in 1 turn. And that's why we're running Oblivious Islander as well as Conspirator to even combo off of Islander on turn 1. And now, we've actually got kind of 2 different decks at the same time. They're 2 slightly different versions of the same concept. So, one of the things that I think is going to be the most powerful is this idea of the Daybreak Invoke archetype. Basically, we're going to be using cards like, all the Solari Soldier, all the Solar Shieldbreaker, all the Daybreak cards in conjunction with all the Invoke cards. Why are we doing this? Well, the reason being is that not because they interact with each other directly so much, but they complement each other very well. The Invoke cards want you to fill out a full Targon deck if you're building around them, because you need the Allegiance off of Mountain Scryer. And what better way to fill out, the Targon deck with the easy, non-committal, just balanced package of Daybreak. All of these cards are cards that are generating really high independent value, and of course we've got Solari Priestess to link both concepts together. Now the question is, how do we want to finish off the package? And in this variation, we've got Braum. Braum is a very just easy to slap in card that's going to be auto winning a lot of games off of the back of being buffed by Mentor of the Stones, Giddy Sparkeologist, or Ridden in the Stars, which is one of the Celestial cards that pulls out a double buffed champion from your deck. Now, alternatively, we've also got this version, which takes the same general start to the deck builds, while finishing out with Stalking Shadows instead of Braum. Basically, the idea behind this is it's just played for a little bit more reliability and draw power, instead of just like the raw beef, because this deck does have a lot of like mid-range value, and you're not necessarily going to be needing Braum in a deck like this. So both decks are going to be pretty equivalent, and it's really dealer's choice which one you might be wanting. Then, we've got Rattling Bones' version of Swain Leona. This is one of the decks that's geared to be probably one of the most competitive moving forward, and it's a really, really straightforward concept. If you've played Runeterra for this past patch, you know that the Swain combo is kind of like one of the most powerful control sort of like archetypes in the game, and combining it with Leona is going to do it very well. Leona gives it access to a lot of the tools that you're going to be wanting with this archetype, notably ways of slowing the game down, ways of punishing the opponent for trying to develop into their attacks. because of course Swain brings to the equation a lot of these fast speed spells that are great at punishing the opponent for open attacking, and Leona helps punish the opponent for developing into the attack. So you've got kind of two sides of the whole that work really nicely together. Next appears Precipix's version of Draven Taric. Draven Taric is basically a deck that is a little bit counterintuitive at first, because most Taric decks are trying to level up Taric as their win condition. This one is taking it in a different direction. Basically, the idea here is maybe sometimes it will result in a leveled up Taric, but for the most part, we're just using Taric for his ability to clone spells, right? And we're using that to do pretty disgusting things like cloning Might, cloning Zenith Blade, or even in some cases cloning Whirling Death or Elixir of Wrath. Basically, Noxus has a ton of high value single target spells, and Taric brings to that the ability to turn that concept and make it, you know, a lot more aggressive, a lot more dangerous. This deck actually is able to use a couple of pretty vanilla cards super well. Startled Stomper looks very innocuous, but when you pull it on turn 2, followed up by a Mentor of the Stones on turn 3, or start buffing it up, it gets really, really gross, really, really fast. Another vanilla card is Fused Firebrand, which comes onto the board turn 5 with these two, abilities, one of which being a spell shield that does not go away on the first turn, because, unless it states otherwise, spell shield does not go away after one turn. This means we're going to be able to buff it up, and the opponent won't be able to react with it, which is, really, really potentially quite gross. And now let's go ahead and take a look at one of my personal preferred versions of Nightfall aggro I've seen, this one by Nick Makes Plays. So this is just kind of like your typical Nightfall aggro, right? The idea is you just want to be able to make sure that you're triggering Nightfalls aggressively and make sure that you've got your win condition for the end, right? So what this deck does is we're running Fading Memories as a 0 mana trigger to the Nightfall keyword. So whenever we want to trigger Nightfall, we can do it super freely off of Fading Memories. We're also running Frenzied Skitterer, which is a pretty important component, which is going to allow our Fearsomes to be that much more scary because it can push opponents out of the ability to block range, and Rekindler just to be a bit of a safety net, for our very squishy Nocturne, who will often be dying on these turns. So Rekindler extends the clock of this deck a little bit and makes it so that, if our momentum gets sort of stopped or slowed down early, we still have a bit of a way to win right after that. And now we get into Thresh, Aurelion Sol. I said earlier that these were going to be in no particular order. I kind of lied a little bit. These ones are actually in just general, not cherry-picked very much at all, but it does gradually get weaker and weaker as we go down the list because we start entering some sort of meme decks. This deck it's going to be pretty funny. I love Aurelion Sol. I love the idea of being able to use Aurelion Sol, and I do think one of the best ways to use Aurelion Sol is to cheat it out very early with something like Thresh, right? This is going to be kind of the objective. We need to be able to pull Aurelion Sol out early because 10 mana is just too expensive, and this is kind of the best way we have for it, right? Now, the rest of this deck builds on top of that and tries to go basically all in on the dragons, right? We're running, we're not running some of like the Dragon's Edge or the Dragon's Herald or stuff like that, but we're running two of the value dragons that we can, and we're trying out the Sky's Descend, which is a very, very interesting card that is basically the anti-mid-range card. It's probably going to be a little too clunky for the time being, but this card is more competitive than it does immediately look, and it might just take a slight little push of synergy for it to be able to finally hit decks. Ultimately, this deck is still going to be winning off of like the Targon win condition package quite often. It's just going to not be able to use Aurelion Sol as well as you might want to hope Aurelion Sol could be used. Unfortunately, Aurelion Sol's 10 mana cost and inability to immediately close out games makes him pretty awkward. I love the card. He's super cool. This is probably not necessarily this deck card for card, but this kind of direction to refine. One of the best ways to use him, trying to pull him out off of Thresh early. And I do think that in a refined metagame, where we actually know what decks we're trying to counter, and we can actually build proper control decks, I'd like to refine a version of this that gets out of the Targon Allegiance and goes more into the Shadow Isles control package, using Thresh to pull out Aurelion Sol, still in the kind of like the mid-game. Then we've got Mr. Wraith Aggro. This is Nick's version, and it's going to be pretty vanilla. You've got exactly what you'd expect out of a Mistwraith deck. You've got Mistwraiths, you've got Wraithcrawlers, you've got Risen Mists, which is the brand new card that makes this quite a bit better, and of course Stalking Shadows. This is going to give us the ability to clone and double down on our Mistwraiths even further. Now, I do want to point out, this deck is better than it looks. I do think that there's some potential in this one. I'm going to have to try it out quite a bit, but overall, this is a deck that, I mean, like I said in the last one, these are not like, okay, this deck is going to be better than the last deck we just showed for sure. They're not in like strictly descending power level order. This is actually a decent deck. Risen Mist, for its mana cost, you're actually totally fine paying this mana cost because summoning a unit at burst speed, whether on offense or defense, is very, very powerful and cannot be understated whatsoever. Reaching the end here, we've got Leona Yasuo. This is, look, listen. It's a Yasuo deck. I don't expect Yasuo to be making like big splashes. I don't expect this to be, you know, the one savior to the meta that we're all banking on. However, Leona does actually present a pretty interesting opportunity for Yasuo to make a bit more sense. Obviously, Leona is going to offer a little bit of stuns, but also some of the Celestial cards that you'll be getting, some of the, you know, Celestials off of your Invokes, will actually be getting stuns as well. For example, Spacey Sketch is going to have a bit under a 40% chance of being able to pull out the sorry, I've got the hiccups. The 3 mana stun 2 units. That's really, really, really great in a Yasuo archetype deck. And then, to top it all off, we've got Zenith Blade. Zenith Blade has the ability to not only be, you know, a Daybreak trigger, which will help the Leona side of things, but when used on Fae Blade Toiler, it can actually be a way to like actually win the game off of like a 10 attack Fae Blade Twirler, which has before been kind of useless because your opponent will just block it out every time. Well, no more. They'll actually have to have a unique answer to stop themselves from dying to the overwhelm of Zenith Blade. And that brings us to the final deck here. This is it, guys. This is the last one. The deck number 11 on our 11 day 1 decks for you guys to try out. The title should have been 10 day 1 decks for you guys to try out. This is the one that you shouldn't try out. This is the Mind Meld deck. Mind Meld is pure memes. This card is not good. Don't actually play this card. Don't actually play this deck. But if you have to, now's a really good time to do it because we've got Poro Cannon. It's hard to imagine a card that could have came out that made so much sense with Mind Meld than Poro Cannon. Poro Cannon is crazy. The ability for this card to be a spell trigger at 0 mana, 0 actions, give you 2 cheap elusives in hand is ridiculous and absolutely everything the Mind Meld archetype could have possibly wanted. Alright guys, and that's it. Those are my 11 day 1 decks for the Targon expansion. Now keep in mind, these are day 1 decks. These are built pure off of Theorycraft. These have no representation of ladder. We are not only able to kind of like play the games out perfectly and refine the list, but we also don't know what the meta will be like. So we don't know, you know, there's so many cards that we don't know if we want because we don't know what we're going to be up against, right? It's a completely new frontier. I'm going to be messing around trying to optimize a bunch of these lists. I'm going to be trying to, you know, make new concepts and add them to this as well. Now, I'm going to be streaming all of this, of course, on Twitch, and it's going to be a lot of fun, just kind of like messing around with these new ones. And honestly, this would be a great opportunity to be able to tell you guys, you know, ooh, I'm going to play this deck, or ooh, I'm going to play that deck first. Honestly, I don't even know what I'll mess around with first. Maybe I'll let chat decide. I'm thinking, you know, I do definitely want to try out the elusive shadow combo, but I know there's going to be like an over-representation of Hush in like the early days of the meta, so I might have to stick with something a little bit more like tempo-oriented for now. Maybe I'll try the Draven Turek. Honestly, I haven't even decided what I want to be messing around with yet, but typically I'll try messing around with like, you know, a bunch of different things until I find one that I just latch onto and I really want to optimize and play around with a lot more. So it's going to be a fun process the next week, just grinding out a ton of hours with all these new cards. And I'll see you guys for this process, whether on YouTube or on Twitch. All right, later guys.